It's the silhouette that brings fear. 70 tons of armored firepower that can kill once every 4 seconds. In every corner of the world, the tank has proved all-conquering, the iron fist that crushes armies and shatters morale. These mighty machines of war represent the culmination of a centuries-old struggle to perfect the art of mobile armored combat. Most generals would want to go to war with the tank.
All right, mount up.
This is the 2nd Platoon D Company, part of the famed 1st Cavalry Division of the United States Army. We're riding out with them as they advance into the field at Fort Hood, Texas. They're aboard the Abrams M1A2, the culmination of a century of tank design. As this killer machine is put through its paces, we'll reveal how the tank was perfected over time. The gun has evolved into an awesome weapon that can take out a moving target 3 kilometers away.
Tank! Far left tank first! Identified! Far and just! On the way!
Warheads can now punch through 800 millimeters of steel. Tank armor has had to become strong enough to repel weapons like these, yet remain light enough to maintain a tank's speed and mobility. The effectiveness of this, the ultimate tank, was proven in 1991 when the Abrams first saw action. During Operation Desert Storm, over 1,500 Abrams tanks went head-to-head with 4,000 Iraqi tanks under the command of Saddam Hussein. Despite the appalling conditions, the Abrams had the edge, according to Lieutenant General Paul Funk.
We were on a 25-kilometer front, and the winds were gusting up to 60 miles an hour. I mean, I called the cavalry squadron commander, the great Terry Tucker, and I said, "What's your visibility like?" He said, 1 to 300 meters. But we know they're here somewhere. Right after that, boom, we slammed into them. I can still see that fight with the tracers, a pause, and then a tank turret going 60 feet in the air when all that ammunition and everything else blew up as a result of the hit by our tankers.
In 4 days, US forces wiped out most of the Iraqi tanks without losing a single tank crew member. The ease with which the fast-moving, fast-shooting Abrams hauls its 70 tons around the battlefield belies the humble beginnings of this quintessential war machine. In the early 1900s, engineer David Roberts was working to devise a way to drive a tractor across the muddy fields of eastern England without the wheels sinking in. He came up with the idea of chain belts fitted with wooden blocks. His tractor would lay out its own rolling road under its wheels as it moved along. This was the first steerable tracked vehicle. The tracks acted like snowshoes, spreading the load over a wide area, preventing the tractor from sliding and sinking into the mud. It wasn't hard to imagine these tractors carrying armor and guns instead of plows and hay bales. In the muddy battlefields of northern France, the First World War had ground to a spluttering halt. Troops were pinned down in their trenches by the murderous efficiency of the machine gun. What was needed was an armoured tractor that could break the stalemate. But the tank that was born out of Roberts's invention looked nothing like the tank we know today, as military historian David Fletcher explains.
This is a Mark IV tank from 1917. The gun is in a sponson on the side. The main reason for this is that within the tank, the engine occupies most of the centre of the vehicle. That in turn is due to the fact that the tank was designed with cross-country movement as its most important feature. The gunnery is really a secondary matter. The original purpose is simply to break the siege that had grown up around the lines of trenches and wire. Its job was to crush down the wire so the infantry didn't get tangled up in it, to keep down the heads of the machine gunners, kill them if possible so the infantry were not massacred, and then drive into and over the trenches. In other words, we'd put the ability to move over the ground above the effects of firepower.
1917, the Battle for Cambrai in northern France. The Mark IV tank was an instant success, breaching the German defences and shielding the advancing infantry from machine gun fire. But the Mark IV had an Achilles heel. Even though the tank moved no faster than walking pace, the crudely riveted track could break, leaving the tank a sitting duck. To understand why these early tracks broke, we've come to a modern tank track factory and asked engineer Jim Rowbottom to run a road test.
We've built a section of track consisting of two different links, and this is made to the same configuration as track would have been built to in 1916.
The track section is pounded on our rocky road for 7 hours to simulate the wear from moving 28 tons of Mark IV tank across the battlefield.
If we look at the links that hold the two pieces of track together and the state of the track pin, the pin has worn because it's been rubbing against the track link. This hole into which the pin was located has elongated quite a lot. The actual structure of the link means that it is quite incapable of a long life, and it has begun to fall apart, which is something that we wouldn't really want to happen.
To minimise metal fatigue in modern track, shock-absorbing rubber bearings are fitted to the pins that connect the links. The rubber bearings also ensure a snug fit, reducing play and wear. Rubber pads are fitted to the underside of the track sections to dampen vibrations from the ground. Compared with the plodding warhorse of World War I, the modern Abrams is a thoroughbred. Its padded tracks can last the course for up to 3,000 miles and give the tank agility at speed. But it's taken almost a century to get to this point. Among the first tanks that could move a little faster than walking pace were these 1917 Renaults. Smaller and lighter than the British Mark IVs, they travelled around the battlefield with a top speed of just under 5 miles an hour. As with all tanks of the time, speed brought with it increased vibration. This placed enormous strains on the tank's components, not to mention its crew. This time, the solution didn't come from farmers, but from the automobile industry. J. Walter Christie, an American engineer in the late 1920s, discovered that equipping each of a tank's wheels with independent suspension gave much more than a comfortable ride. These Christie prototype tanks were lightweight and agile. Without suspension, a tank can't move quickly over the rough terrain of a battlefield. Christie's design kept the track in contact with the ground and gave the tank superior handling. The US Army were impressed, but couldn't convince the irascible Christie to manufacture his tank to their specifications. When the communist Russians heard the Americans hadn't used the suspension system, they snapped up Christie's design for their new tank.
This is the Soviet T-34, deemed by many to be the finest tank of the Second World War. Its most interesting characteristic by far is this suspension system, the method of springing. It enabled tank to travel fast across country without completely wrecking the physical health of the crew. You ever get the chance to see a Christie tank on the move over rough country going fast? These wheels are literally bounding up and down, quite independently of one another, but they're giving the crew a superbly comfortable ride for their day.
More important than comfort was the additional speed that Christie's suspension gave to these tanks. Fully armed and laden, the T-34 could go into battle at 40 kilometers an hour. During the Battle of the Kursk in the summer of 1943, wave after wave of Russian T-34s proved too much for the German armoured divisions. 60 years later, and the bigger, heavier Abrams can cross the battlefield at over 65 kilometers an hour. As well as speed, it boasts the tank's second great asset, a powerful gun. This gun can launch deadly projectiles that kill at a range of 3 kilometers. But first, you have to find your enemy and get them in your sights. In Operation Desert Storm in 1991, outnumbered US tank forces were fighting on unfamiliar terrain, in atrocious conditions, and at night. But when it came to hunting down their targets, the Abrams had the technological edge.
They had night capability, but we had the thermal imaging sights and capabilities, and so we could see about at night 3 times farther than they could.
First contact this unit had with the enemy came in poor visibility at night.
We got off the first set of rounds. The Iraqis were turning their turrets at the same time. We got off the first set of rounds. 2/3 of the Iraqi tanks were on fire. The next volley from our guns before they could fire, and all of them were dead.
The Abrams thermal imaging system works by detecting any object on the battlefield radiating heat. Because it sees heat, not light, it can work in pitch darkness.
Tank! Fire and adjust.
Using his thermal imaging screen, the tank commander scours the horizon. An enemy tank appears as a hot silhouette. Its heat signal shines brightly on the screen. He passes this on to his gunner sitting in front of him.
Tanks! Designate left tank. Identified. Fire and adjust. On the way.
Our job is to work together as a team. We had a gunner's position here. He's the guy they call the killer in the hunter-killer team, and I'm the hunter.
PC! We're near PC!
They've located the target. To fire accurately and kill, the gunner needs to know the exact range.
Fire and adjust.
On the way!
I have a laser rangefinder. When I see the target, I'll press these buttons here. It sends out a laser, which comes back and gives me a range to that target.
The laser rangefinder is the last word in accuracy. It works by sending a laser pulse in a narrow beam towards the target and measuring how long it takes for the pulse to bounce off and return to the Abrams. As the speed of light is constant, it's a simple calculation for the onboard computer to make. Thanks to their laser technology, the Abrams crew can seek out and hit a moving target while traveling at full speed over rough terrain. Back to 1916, and in the tanks of the First World War, gunners had very little technology to help them in the mayhem of battle. They worked out the range to the target using trial and error. It was a technique passed down from their artillery ancestors of the 17th century. Guns were heavy and had to be manhandled into position. They were sighted by eye, and range was guessed at. The noise and smoke of battle didn't make it any easier. We've asked artillery expert Colin Herriot to demonstrate how difficult and slow it is to aim a big gun and hit the target. Colin will try to hit this, a barn door, from about 100 metres away. His only aid is a homemade replica gunner's rule, the 17th century equivalent of a laser rangefinder.
This is the gunner's rule. See the mark stick. I aim the bottom mark on the gunner's rule at the muzzle ring and aim it at what I want to shoot at. Spot on.
He'll keep firing till he finds the range and hits the target. It's a technique known as straddling.
Uncover your vent. Firing. Give him fire. So we've overshot with that, so let's depress the barrel, see if we can get her considerably lower. And so we may fall short, we'll just have to see. That's how we straddle. And then if we do fall short, we know the next one, we just raise it a little bit more and we should hit the target. Firing! Give him fire. Seem to have kissed in front of the target there, so we've got to elevate just a little bit more to try and smack somewhere in the middle. Firing! Give him fire!
Colin is a skilled gunner, and working quickly, he can only fire 2 to 3 rounds a minute. Every telltale puff of smoke from his cannon gives away his position, making him a target. Fast forward 300 years, and First World War tank gunners were just as slow at finding their range.
I'm in the position of the starboard gunner. He's got this control arm sticking out here, which fits under the right armpit. His right hand then goes forward to this pistol grip arrangement under here, and then he sets his eye to the telescope here. And now, using his body weight, he can elevate and depress the gun, and even, to some extent, swing it round to track a target. The gun will fire out to about 7,000 yards. In fact, at anything more than 1,000, you'd be lucky to see anything, never mind hit it. Don't forget that the gunner can't see anything else, only what's to his telescope. So he's virtually got to be directed into whereabouts in his arc the target is in the first place.
If the tank was to improve, the whole process of aiming and firing needed to be speeded up. The breakthrough came from the war at sea rather than the war on land. The British Royal Navy had used an optical system to calculate range for some time. It helped their gunners hit targets many miles away. But the range-finding equipment was big and heavy, not easy to fit into a turret. It wasn't till towards the end of the Second World War that this optical range-finding technology was made compact enough. Two lenses were positioned on either side of the turret. Each lens was connected to the same eyepiece by prisms. As the distance between lenses is known, the distance to the target is calculated using trigonometry. The gunner sees two images, one from the left, one from the right. Turning a hand crank pivots the lenses on either side till the images line up and merge. Better optics and rangefinders meant tanks could hit targets at far greater distances. This encouraged tank designers to fit much bigger guns with more power. One of the most feared tanks of the Second World War was the German Tiger, with the most powerful gun yet mounted on a tank.
It's an 88mm high-velocity gun that was originally designed for anti-aircraft work, and the British had already come to dread it in the desert. the Germans had enough flexibility in their system to convert their anti-aircraft guns into the anti-tank role. With a gun like that, the sort of accuracy and hitting power it's got, you could take out other tanks at ranges where they cannot effectively take you out in return. That's its real asset, that big gun.
Even as it destroyed everything it came across, the Tiger had one weakness. It couldn't fire its gun on the move. The gun's powerful recoil would have seriously damaged the turret unless the tank was stationary. The tank's crew had to halt, swing the turret, unlock and elevate, aim, then fire. By the time they'd done all this, they might have lost the advantage of their big gun and become a target themselves. Even tanks with smaller guns couldn't fire accurately on the move simply because their barrels bounced around so much. Engineers had to come up with a mechanism that would keep the barrel steady, however rough the terrain. They began with this, a gyroscope. A gyroscope is a spinning wheel on an axle. Once spinning, it resists changes to its direction due to the forces created by the fast rotation of the wheel. If a spinning gyroscope is put into an environment that rolls around, it'll remain stable. Connect the gyro to the controls that position the gun, and the gun remains locked to the gyro. It's totally stabilized. The gyros in an Abrams tank keep the gun barrel steady, even as the tank crosses the roughest terrain. By fitting further gyros, it's possible to keep the gun locked on target so it can fire on the move with accuracy. Now the tank had an accurate and powerful gun that could fire on the move, designers could turn their attention to what it fired, its ammunition. During the Second World War, designers came up with an ever-growing arsenal of deadly weapons. One of these was known as the squash head. To kill a tank crew, it doesn't even have to get through the armor. To demonstrate the deadly nature of this weapon, we've asked chemist and explosives designer Sidney Alford to set up an experiment.
So here we have 150 grams of plastic explosive.
Sidney has welded steel armor to a metal plate and bolted this in place on the side of a mock-up turret.
I'm going to plonk it onto that target, thus.
His challenge, to destroy the inside of the turret without penetrating the armor.
I'll plonk it a bit more.
This plastic explosive he's patting into place will replicate the behavior of the real squash head.
That now represents the explosive which has arrived inside a shell which has squashed itself against the target. I'll take the detonator.
Inserting the detonator turns the harmless, inert putty into a lethal explosive that could blow most of the roof off a house. There's a melon sitting in for the crew.
Goodbye, melon. I said that. Firing! 4, 3, 2, 1. Here we are.
At first glance, it looks as though Sidney's squash head has failed to do its work.
But if you look round the back of the plate, I think I see one former melon, which is no more. And here, still warm. You would not like to share the inside of a tank with this travelling at, I would guess, roughly the speed of sound.
This scab of steel has been blasted off the inside of the armour.
What I'll do now is unbolt this and we can have a good look. There we are.
The squash head shell looks like any other as it leaves the gun tube. On impact with the turret, it sticks to the surface like a cowpat. The shock waves from the explosive cause little damage on the outside, but devastation on the inside. In the Second World War, the German Tiger quickly earned a reputation for being almost invincible. But it was severely compromised as a fighting machine.
Its armour is thicker than virtually any tank before it, over 100 millimetres at the front. It weighs something in the region of 56 tonnes. As a consequence, it comes with all manner of limitations. To give an example, in order to bear this great weight, extra wide tracks are needed and loads of wheels to press on the tracks. It is so heavy that it is endlessly stressing the engine and gearbox. You get this thing into a really difficult country, you stand a pretty fair chance of having it completely disable itself. It was totally on the limit in terms of weight and power for anything that had been seen in action before.
Tank designers needed to come up with lighter armour without losing any protection. One solution came from the Russian T-34, with an innovation that others were to copy: sloping armour. This piece of armour is 100 millimetres thick when positioned vertically. Angled at 30 degrees, the armour becomes twice as thick at 200 millimetres. To keep the armour at 100 millimetres thick only requires half as much steel, making the tank significantly lighter. The sloping armour of the T-34 had a downside. There was much less room in the front of the tank for the driver and the gunner. The solution? Smaller conscripts. On the plus side, some conventional shells simply bounced off. Sloping armour forced weapons designers to think again. They were looking for something to penetrate this new generation of protection. The struggle between ammunition and armour entered a new phase. In their quest to come up with more deadly weapons, designers looked back into history and surprisingly found the answer in a principle discovered in the 17th century. In the days of the big sieges, gunners observed they were losing power from their cannons. A cannonball had to be loose enough not to jam in the barrel. This allowed a lot of the force of the gunpowder to escape through the gap around the sides. Gunners devised an ingenious way to plug this gap, a tightly fitting wooden bung called a sabot, or wooden shoe.
Well, I'm just fixing the sabot here onto the base of the round shot, or cannonball if you like.
400 years on, we've asked artillery expert Colin Herriot to demonstrate what a sabot round does.
It's just a piece of wood like that. When the cannon fires, if you've just got a cannonball in there, you lose a lot of power. With this lump of flat wood, the blast would hit it. And before this blows apart and disintegrates, in that millisecond, that will give the initial impetus and will throw the cannonball further and faster.
That was the theory. Colin has 2 attempts to prove it. He'll fire his cannon at this makeshift target. The first round will be a plain shot without the sabot, and the second will have his homemade sabot attached.
Righto.
For both shots, the distance to the target is the same. The amount of powder and charge and the size and weight of cannonball identical. It's a test to see which round has more power.
The plan is to shoot a naked ball. Ball's going in. She's primed and she's ready to go. Even. Give fire.
The first round hits the target, but it's very low down.
Here's the ball. She's come through there. hit there and bounced off.
Will the shot with the sabot attached do any better?
Leave it. Give him fire.
Whoa, look at that. Smack dead centre. The ball's gone through a good 4 inches of very strong Douglas fir. Not only does the sabot give it more power, but it do give it more accuracy. She's ploughed right through. Let's have a look around the back end, see what it's done there.
The simple addition of a small disc of wood has effectively increased the punching power of Collins' cannon by a third.
Come through pretty fast. We then have the second target over here. It's hit it so fast, it's almost as if the wood doesn't even know it's been hit. Right through.
Late in the Second World War in 1943, a Belgian scientist working for the British took the sabot principle one step further. Ladislaus Permutter calculated that a smaller projectile would fly through the air much faster than a big shell. And if this projectile were made from a dense, heavy material like tungsten carbide, it could penetrate even the thickest armor. But how to fire a small projectile from a big gun? Permutter's solution, a sabot that encased the projectile, increasing its girth, making it fit snugly into the barrel. No power was lost when the gun was fired. Armour expert Dr. Paul Hazel.
This is a relatively modern version of what Permutter invented in 1943, and what we have here is the penetrator, which is enclosed by this boot or this sabot, which carries this penetrator up the gun barrel, and when the whole assembly leaves the gun barrel, the sabot becomes separated by the air resistance that is offered to the sabot. And it's essentially like a very fast-moving crossbow bolt.
As it sits in the breech, the sabot holds the projectile firmly in place. When the gun is fired, the assembly moves rapidly up the barrel. Almost immediately, the sabot peels away and falls to the ground. On impact, there's no explosion. The speed and density of the penetrator cuts through armor, causing complete devastation.
This is an example of a target that's been struck by a 120mm sabot round. And here we have the type of projectile that was used. And as you can see around the outside of the target, we can see quite a significant amount of plastic deformation. In other words, the material has moved apart and has been permanently deformed as the projectile penetrates.
These super-penetrating weapons inspired new concepts in armor. They experimented with special composites, using layers of ceramic and glass fiber sandwiched between steel. Some layers reduce the transmission of shock from squash-head rounds. Others provide resistance to new penetrating projectiles. The Abrams is clad in layers of composite armor designed to offer the best protection for its crew. In the first Gulf War of 1991, superior armor gave US forces another tactical edge. Lieutenant General Paul Funk.
In Desert Storm, we knew we could not be penetrated in the frontal 60-degree arc, which is generally the best protected part of any fighting vehicle. We knew that we could not be penetrated at ranges over 500 meters. So our idea was we were going to stand off at least 500 meters in any kind of a direct fire fight with tanks or with their missiles, and we believed we could defeat them without losing our own crews. In fact, that proved to be true.
Good armor meant Abrams crews felt safe enough to get in closer, then hit harder with their powerful gun.
I can recall one battalion commander talking about his guy calling him back, one of his company commanders, and telling him the RPGs are bouncing off the tanks up here. And he thought that was pretty good, as he said, and I thought it was damn good. I mean, that's a great feeling, not one that you want to go out and try every day, but nevertheless, when you have that happen, you know, that gives you a little extra boost because you know your equipment's working the way it was supposed to.
In the contest between ammunition and armour, more weapons were being devised with ever more devious powers of destruction. One of them was the shaped charge, first used in battle during the Second World War. This simple, handheld, disposable weapon could immobilize a tank if you could get close enough. It quite literally changes shape to do its deadly work. It's better known today as the rocket-propelled grenade, or RPG. The shaped charge consists of a thin copper cone wrapped with explosive. On impact, the explosive is detonated and a powerful shock wave turns the copper cone inside out, creating a high-speed jet of hot copper. When the shell hits the tank and the explosive is detonated, it's this jet which literally cuts through the armour. We've brought together two experts in explosives to demonstrate the devastating power of a shaped charge, Manfred Helt and Sidney Alford. They'll fire a shaped charge at a stack of steel plates mounted onto the side of a scale mock-up of a tank turret. They stack up 10 plates of steel, each 5 millimeters thick. That's 50 millimeters of armour.
Yeah, I agree.
But the plates are angled at 30 degrees like sloped armour. This doubles the thickness to 100 millimeters.
Okay?
Yes.
Now, can we move it in, please?
Yep. How much?
Leave it in 3 centimeters.
What is the stand of exactly now?
250 millimeters.
250, and you 1, 2, 3.
Manfred and Sidney have allowed some distance between the copper cone of the shaped charge and the armour plates to replicate the way a real charge behaves.
Better not tell him what's going to happen.
No.
A steel witness plate is hung behind the melon to record the penetrating power of the charge. Sidney inserts the detonator and retreats.
Okay, ready to fire. Fire. 4, 3, 2, 1. So that charge behaved as a classic shaped charge. The piece of copper forming the cone, which started with a diameter of about 65 millimeters, has been squeezed down into a long rod, which was travelling exceedingly fast, going through the plate, through the melon, and the other side of the tank. Remember the witness plate that we hung up inside? The melon has exploded. The jet has divided to give 2 holes. It's impressive and deadly.
Sidney's small charge has blasted through 100 millimeters of steel plate. It has only a proportion of the power of a real rocket-propelled grenade.
This is a PG-7 grenade, and quite typically this type of warhead can penetrate approximately 300 millimeters of steel. So if you take a look at this steel stack that I've got here, that means it can penetrate 1, 2, 3 layers of steel. Other variants of this type of warhead can penetrate anything up to between 7 or even 800 millimeters of steel. So it's a very, very dangerous threat.
But what can be done to stop shaped charges penetrating a tank turret? A young Manfred Helt went to the Middle East after the Six-Day War of 1967 to test shaped charges against the armour of wrecked tanks left in the desert. He saw it as an opportunity to work with real armour out in the field. As he filmed his work, he noticed some tanks were less damaged after the explosion. He realized that his charge had detonated the munitions stored in the turret. The blast had somehow cancelled out the force of his shaped charge. Manfred had stumbled on something with amazing potential. He'd hit on what he called explosive reactive armour. Explosive reactive armour consists of a sheet of high explosive sandwiched between two steel plates. When a penetrating weapon hits it, the explosive layer detonates, forcing the two metal plates apart, repelling the incoming missile. Manfred Helt's design comes in the form of explosive boxes fixed to the outside of a tank. It's one of the more recent concepts in armour. To demonstrate Manfred's invention, we've asked him and Sidney Alford to fire another shaped charge.
What we'll do now, we'll fire exactly the same charge, at exactly the same distance, at exactly the same target, but this time we now have a layer of Professor Helt's armour.
One drawback with explosive reactive armour is that anyone outside the tank is in danger of being hit by flying shrapnel. Sidney has built a protective canopy to try and contain the fragments.
Everybody ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Firing! 4, 3, 2, 1. Woohoo!
Some of the steel plates look as though they've been penetrated.
This is interesting. It's deflected the shot considerably. The actual penetration is, I think, much less. And may I congratulate you, Professor Helt, your arm has worked very well. It hasn't come through. Now, there's a hole here, and that implies that the piece of armour hit it there and continued going. How far it went, I'm not sure.
When the 10 steel plates are laid out alongside those from the previous experiment, it's clear explosive reactive armour has protected the inside of the turret. The charge has only penetrated the top 3 layers of armour.
I think that this is a pretty unambiguous demonstration of the effectiveness of reactive armour. That's pretty conclusive.
It's conclusive.
Explosive reactive armour marked a watershed in the battle between weapons and protection. New technologies mean the future may lie with active armour systems that detect and detonate warheads before they get close to a tank. For designers, this is the holy grail. They could take away tons of passive, heavy conventional armour and devise smaller, lighter vehicles. This would answer some strategists who feel that the concept of the tank is outdated and that modern armies need faster vehicles for rapid reaction forces.
Do we need tanks anymore? I mean, that's for other people to decide, but we better think about it. This evolution has been an armor anti-armor, mobile protected firepower against the enemy's counter. I think you're always going to have a tank-like vehicle. Hell, let's not call it a tank anymore. I don't care, call it a horse. But I think what we have to have is, what is it that's going to fulfill the role that the tank plays today on tomorrow's battlefield?
One proposal is this: the Striker. It doesn't yet have active armor, but it's lighter and more mobile than the Abrams. It's available in many different versions and was designed to be airlifted into war zones. Inside, a self-loading gun and a virtual battlefield on screens add to the complexity of the technology that can go wrong. Used in the recent conflict in Iraq, it was found wanting. Its armor couldn't keep out cheap and readily available rocket-propelled grenades. Once equipped with the extra protection needed, the Striker becomes too large to be airlifted and deployed quickly. Over the last 100 years, the tank has benefited from countless improvements in technology and established itself as the supreme armoured fighting vehicle. The big question is, has it reached its limits? As the escalating battle between firepower and protection gathers pace once more, designers have plenty to keep them busy, to keep this machine of war, the tank, in the front line.